was master of this lodge in 2012. So I joined in 2006. Prior to that, I was in the Army for about 9 years. Grew up in Iowa, lived in Des Moines, Iowa my entire life until my 18th birthday. 5 days after my birthday, I was off to the Army and was military police in the Army for a while and then an Army CID agent. And I was always interested in fraternal type organizations. I was in Boy Scouts as a kid, ROTC in high school, things like that. And as an adult, I started studying history a little more, and George Washington in particular. I read just about every book I could find on Washington. And on a visit home, I met with an old scout leader of mine, and while I was at his house, I noticed he had a Shriner Fez in the corner on his bookshelf, and so we started talking about masonry for a while. And that kind of started my path. And it wasn't until several years later, and my best friend actually joined before I did. I had piqued his interest, and he joined before I did, and was one of my vouchers when I finally decided to pull the cord and join. And I didn't know this lodge existed. I didn't know there was a Lodge of Washington at the time. And I contacted the Grand Lodge, who put me in touch with the district deputy Grand Master that year, who was Frank Dunaway. And he was the chaplain of this lodge at the time, and a past master, past district deputy. So it was just fortuitous that I connected with the Lodge of Washington after I just so recently taken up such an interest in Washington and the history. And that's what brought me to this lodge and masonry. So in 2006, I joined the lodge that spring. Bob Watkins was the senior warden at the time, and he was my mentor and coach. I lived about 10 minutes from the memorial at the time, and we would meet up here in the mornings before work, walk around the parking lot and learn the catechism. And because he was senior warden and later master, at the end of that year, he asked me if I would be his senior steward. So from then on, I was an officer in the lodge, and I have been ever since.
Goals, accomplishments.
So my year as master began in December 2011, like they all do, and 2 months before that, my daughter was born, so I had a newborn infant at home. The month before that, in November 2011, I'd become a supervisor at work. So my year as master was very, very busy, both at home, at work, and in the lodge. So the year, I started planning fairly early. I had some good mentors and masters before me that gave me some planning tips. I had several guest speakers lined up. I had several authors come that year. The most interesting later became Grand Master of Kansas. He wrote a book on masonry during the Civil War. He was actually the first speaker that I lined up, and it's an interesting book that actually names our lodge in the book. So that was one of my most interesting meetings that year. Yeah, so in addition to some of our programs and speakers, I also tried to improve the business operations of the lodge some. At the time, we had, I think, 9 different financial accounts, and from talking with past masters and the treasurer and secretary, we decided that it was best to consolidate some of those for efficiency and just streamline some of the operations of the lodge. So a lot of people are afraid to make changes, especially in masonry. The bylaws and rules and regulations and things sometimes seem daunting, but I'd encourage anybody, especially officers in the lodge, that if you see something you think doesn't work quite right, find out why it is the way it is, and if it could be better, then work to change that. There's no such thing as the way it's always been, despite what some people want to say. So Washington's legacy and impact on AW22 and really all of masonry is really hard to put into words. I think to some degree masonry wouldn't exist in the way it does without George Washington being a Mason. And definitely this lodge. I mean, this entire structure that we're sitting in was built to protect relics of our lodge that were from George Washington. He was just such an amazing man, and the way he lived his life really outlines the ideals of masonry, of self-improvement, subduing your passions, and continuously trying to better yourself and your fellow man. And that was really what Washington was all about, and it's what Masonry is all about. Unique aspects of AW22, there's so many. I mean, there are a lot of great Masonic lodges in the world, all around the country and the world. There's some really great Masonic lodges. Our lodge is unique specifically because of our connection to Washington. We have a direct connection with George Washington that very few other lodges do. And the history we have, a continuous history going back to the 1700s. We have our archives, which are arguably the oldest continuously operating museum in the country. I don't know of any others that have been continuously operating as long as ours has. Masonic influences have really been kind of varied, and it's hard to pinpoint like a few specific people, but I've mentioned Bob Watkins earlier, was my mentor and coach when I first joined the lodge. He was the master that put me in the officer line. So he obviously had a big impact on my Masonic journey and my life in the lodge. Another one I would mention would be a brother named Roy Barnard. He was on my investigating committee, so he was one of the first members of our lodge that I met. And he was just such a kind and humble man. He never joined the officer line. He never sought any titles or accolades or anything like that. But for my first probably 3 to 5 years in the lodge, Roy was at every single meeting. Degrees, stated, he was at everything and always willing to help out. And people like him, I think, really embody the spirit of Freemasonry. They're not after accolades and recognition, but just there to help and enjoy the experience and share it with their brothers. So I guess some of my favorite Masonic memories just involve relationships built with other brothers in the lodge. My year as steward, we had meals before the lodge meeting, and the master had some very long programs that year. So I would come early, and also back then we didn't cater our meals, so the steward was expected to purchase all the food, come early, prepare the meal, and serve it. So I would come up here. I would usually leave work early on Thursdays. I got a Costco membership for the first time that year. Come up here with a box of food and start cooking at about 5:30 to have dinner ready at 6:30. And then so that I could attend the programs that were usually pretty interesting, we would leave all the dirty dishes and everything downstairs and come up, attend the meeting, and then go down and clean up the kitchen afterwards. And it was myself and a few other brothers that were always there to help me. And afterwards we would just stay. Sometimes we would stand in the parking lot till 2:30 in the morning. Thankfully I was single at the time. But we would just stand out there and chat, sometimes about Masonry, sometimes about politics, sometimes about life. And our conversations about Masonry really went in a lot of different directions. We would debate and argue and agree and disagree, and some really good ideas about the direction of the lodge, programs we could have in the future, and just the way you interact with our brothers. It was I don't want to say transformative experience. I don't want to overstate it, but it was a good time. My favorite degree is a little hard to, it's hard to pick one because they all have special meaning and impact on people. I think I have to go with the third degree, the Master Mason degree, just because of the theme of keeping faith. I think is important and a valuable lesson, and the way it's portrayed through that drama of the third degree is really impactful, especially if you don't know anything about it beforehand. I mean, you can read things on the internet that can be true or not. I purposely tried to avoid any information about the degrees before I went through them because I wanted to experience it firsthand without any preconceived notions or anything. So the third degree, going through it and witnessing it from the sidelines, I think is a very impactful degree for its moral lessons and just teaching the importance of keeping faith. So the future of Freemasonry and AW22 are, as with everything else, a little bit uncertain. But Masonry and its traditions and its rituals slow things down a little bit, I think, because as society changes and evolves and ebbs and flows in the different aspects, Masonry stays constant. As we talk about in some of the degrees, Masonry stands firm. And the morality lessons that are taught in Masonry are universal. People like to equate Masonry to a religion. It's not a religion, but it does have those morality aspects and teachings that are just invaluable to men in general. And it's also important that it is a fraternity. It's for men. When I think the future of Masonry may come into question more as people try to blend and say there's no differences and it's not important to have male and female organizations. I don't know where that'll go. I think some countries are kind of merging and allowing women to join Masonry, and it'll be interesting to see how that changes. Some personal lessons for new Masons, I would say to make it your own experience. Don't try to follow anyone else's path. Do the things that interest you and enjoy you. Study as much as you can about Masonry. There's so much to learn, so many different perspectives and opinions. There's hundreds of books, some of them good, some of them terrible. Just read as much as you can and attend as much as you can. Attend events, attend meetings, attend degrees. Like anything else, you get out of it what you put into it. Yeah, my favorite bit of ritual, without divulging too much, I would say is one of the prayers from the second section of the third degree. It alludes to mortality, and I kind of used that theme during my year as master also. Memento Mori, remember your mortality, was my theme that year. And it's not to focus on death, but to focus on the value of your life and the time you have here on earth and to make the most of it. So after my year in the East, that December, we were in need of a new treasurer. So the incoming master, my senior warden, asked me if I would stay on and continue to serve the lodge as treasurer. So that in December 27th of 2012, at the end of my year as master, I became the treasurer of the lodge, and each master since that time has asked me to continue in that role.